us from, because we have people from all time zones. Welcome. I am Shobi Ali, an Indo-Guyanese living in London since childhood. I have studied Caribbean culture and indentureship history for my degree. This is the 166th edition of our Zoom public meeting. We wish to sincerely thank you all, and however you have contributed to the success of this ongoing Pan-Indo-Caribbean and Pan-Indian diaspora global project. For 165 unbroken, continuous weeks, we have been here every single Sunday. In the past 3 years, 5 months and 2 weeks, we have featured an impressive 716 presenters from all parts of the world, speaking on 165 topics. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a weekly forum being hosted by the Indo-Caribbean Cultural Centre, a legally registered research and publishing company which has been operating since 2010. In order to continue this weekly program and to make it bigger and better, we are asking for your suggestions and volunteers, as well as your kind donations. This is a public meeting tonight. It will take the form of a pre-recorded interview and a panel discussion, which will be followed by a Q&A. This meeting is being recorded live and would be later uploaded to our YouTube channel permanently for posterity. This meeting is also being live streamed on the YouTube channel of the Indo-Caribbean Cultural Centre. Welcome to all our viewers on YouTube. To avoid intrusions from trolls, Ravin Ramsingh, our IT manager, has muted everyone. Speakers, please do not admit anyone or do not unmute anyone, and do not allow anyone to share your screen. Thank you for your cooperation. I will now hand you over to our moderator for tonight's program, who will be Shakira Mohammed. She's from Trinidad and Tobago. She has been a teacher for the past 15 years. She will explain to you today's event. Shakira, please take over from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Shobi, and a warm welcome to everyone for joining us, depending on which time zone you are in. We so welcome you and so appreciate you being here with us. Over the next 2 hours, we will be viewing and discussing the issues raised in the pre-recorded interview on the topic Indians in Uganda and East Africa, Retrospection and Realities. So, East Africa in the 1960s was the setting where issues of political independence, the dismantling of an economic system based on racial segregation, the future of multiculturalism, and the rights of racial minorities were all being played out against the backdrop of the winds of change, which were blowing relentlessly across the African continent. The future of some 360,000 Asians hung in abeyance as the political drama unfolded, culminating in the Ugandan Asian expulsion of 1972, where Idi Amin Dada expelled some 80,000 Asians in 90 days. Today, we are very fortunate to view a conversation between two leading scholars of that period, Dr. Mohammed Keshavji, who is joining us today, a globally respected specialist on cross-cultural mediation, who was a practicing lawyer in Kenya at that time, and Dr. Ria Kapoor of London University. She's a migration historian and author of the book entitled Making Refugees in India. To join us in our discussion today, we also have Ms. Lata Desai, who is here with us, and she's the chairperson of the Subrang Arts, a leading South Asian arts organization in England. So Lataji was a co-curator and project leader of a major exhibition called Gujarati Yatra, The Journey of a People. This exhibition was inspired by her own personal story of a family from India to Africa and finally to Britain. So after the video where Dr. Ria Kapoor interviews Mohammed Keshavji, we will welcome questions. Okay, Ravin, will show the pre-recorded interview now, which is about 1 hour long. So Raven?
Greetings, my name is Max Russell and I am the social researcher for the From East to West, the History of Ugandan Asians Oral History project. Discussions on the Ugandan Asian expulsion often focus exclusively on the fateful event in August 1972 when self-styled dictator Idi Amin decided to expel some 80,000 Asians from the country within a period of 90 days. However, very little or nothing is heard of the pathology of conflict and those intervening years between the granting of political independence by Britain and the expulsion of the Ugandan Asians. Today, we are very fortunate to have with us two individuals who have dwelt on this era of post-colonial history with greater depth, analysis and reflection. They are Dr. Muhammad M. Khashoggi, a leading Indo-African commentator on the Indian diaspora in Africa, and Dr. Ria Kapoor, an author and a migration historian from Queen Mary University of London. Dr. Khashoggi, an author, was a practicing lawyer in Nairobi, Kenya when the expulsion decree was ordered in 1972. Being a displaced person of Indian origin who arrived in Kenya from South Africa with his 11 siblings a decade earlier, their citizenship applications were held in perpetual abeyance. He therefore was able to view the situation from a very close proximity, a proximity of precariousness. A barrister of law qualified in 3 common law jurisdictions, Dr. Khashoggi eventually ended up in Canada in 1980, following which he moved to France to work for an international development organization for the next 30 years. For most of this time, he travelled throughout many countries in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. For the past 50 years, Dr. Khashoggi has been a keen observer of the Asian situation in Africa and has written a number of books and contributed articles on this subject to various publications. In 2015, he wrote the book Into That Heaven of Freedom, The Impact of Apartheid on an Indian Family's Diasporic History, with a foreword by Ahmed Kathrada, a close prison inmate of President Nelson Mandela. In 2017, Dr. Khashoggi wrote a book of short stories entitled Diasporic Distractions, which highlights the predicament of the Asians in East Africa in the immediate post-independence period. This book, launched at the University of Malaya, received critical acclaim from Malay Siakini, a leading blog in the country. Dr. Khashoggi is a scholar of conflict resolution, having attained a doctorate in this field from the School of Oriental and African Studies, London University. For some 12 years, he conducted mediation training programs in over 25 countries of the world. For his global work in mediation, peace and human rights education, he was conferred with the 2016 Gandhi King Ikeda Peace Award by the Martin Luther King Jr. International Chapel at Morehouse College, Atlanta, where he was invited to be the memorial speaker on the 48th anniversary of the passing of Dr. King. In conversation with Dr. Khashoggi today, we have Dr. Ria Kapoor. Dr. Kapoor is a historian of refugees, immigrations and rights, with a focus on the Afro-Asian world and its impact on the international and global orders. She has a Doctor of Philosophy and History from the University of Oxford and has worked at various universities in the UK, including the Universities of Manchester and Leeds. She also holds a Master's in International History from the Geneva Graduate Institute and an undergraduate degree from St. Stephen's College of the University of Delhi. Dr. Kapoor is author of the book Making Refugees in India, a 2022 Oxford University Press publication. In addition, she has contributed a number of articles to many leading journals and is presently working on a history of the 1972 Ugandan Asian expulsion and the subsequent resettlement of these Asians across the globe. Today's discussion between these two great individuals presents a unique opportunity to explore history that is often overlooked. As previously noted, the Ugandan Asian expulsion in 1972 has attracted media and academic coverage, especially last year as a result of the 50th anniversary. What has been less addressed are the underlying causes of this seismic event and the precarious situation South Asians found themselves in Africa at the end of empire in the 1960s. Today's conversation hopefully will provide new insights reflecting on materials and anecdotes that are not normally in the public domain, but are critical in the educational field if we really want to come to grips with the story of different migrations in the 20th and 21st centuries. Before the discussion begins, we at From East to West would like to give our appreciation to the various other projects and organisations who have helped bring attention to not just the history of the Ugandan Asian diaspora, but that of the wider South Asian diaspora. I now pass you over to Dr. Ria Kapoor.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Max. So before we get started with the real meat of this discussion, perhaps we should begin well prior to the expulsion at the phenomenon of the arrival of the South Asian population in East Africa and Africa more broadly. How did they come to be on this continent? Was it part of a longer-standing Indian Ocean trade? Was it the British Empire? Or was it something else? And what was the position of this community prior to formal decolonization? Were they involved in this movement towards independence?
I think maybe we should start with my providing a small clarification on terminology. For the purposes of our discussion today, I'll use the word Asian, but historically it was Indian. After the partition of India in 1947, the term Indian took a different connotation because there were among the population some people who had Indian passports and others who acquired Pakistani passports. So having said that, I will use the word Asian to mean the large bulk of the people at the time of independence. And remember that the term Asian in the East African context of that time did not include Chinese, they did not include Japanese, they did not include Taiwanese, they didn't include Filipinos. There may have been small amounts of those people, small numbers of those people in the country. But largely the term Asian in East Africa meant people who originated from the Indian subcontinent. And subsequently they may have become the three countries of India, Pakistan and Bangladesh. Having said that, in the South African context, the term Indian had a different connotation. In a quadruplicate categorization, it meant the whites, the blacks, the coloreds, and the Indians. So today, in 2023, the term Indian in South Africa has a meaning that it had in the time of the apartheid. So I just wanted that terminology to be clear in the minds of our audience so that they have an idea of who we are referring to. Now, Ria, the Indians were in the Indian Ocean area, or have been for the last 2,000 years. Indians were at the heart of the trade that brought the influences of the greater world to the coast of East Africa and to many parts of the east coast of Africa and right down to the southern part. So they were there, and this has been chronicled by a Greek travel writer called Hippolus in his book, The Periples of the Erythraean Sea, which was written in AD 100. Now remember, the Indian Ocean was largely controlled by the Arabs. They were trading with Mesopotamia, with Persia, with China, with India. So the Arabs were in control of the Indian Ocean trade. Come the 15th century, we begin to see a challenge to the Arab hegemony on the Indian Ocean, primarily by the Portuguese. And remember, in 1498, Vasco da Gama came to the coast of southern Africa. And he came to Calicut, he came to Malindi, came to East Africa, and he had an Indian pilot, Ibn Majid, who accompanied him right up to Calicut. So from 1498 to 1510, the Portuguese naval strategists like Afonso de Albuquerque, Francisco de Almeida, operate from the Portuguese hub in India, which is based in Goa. They were the governors of Goa. And I think that Goa and that part of Western India was called the Estado da India. That means it was the Portuguese state in India. And from there, the Portuguese naval administrators and strategists built forts in strategic ports that they'd taken over. Hormuz, Socotra, Malacca. That gave them access to the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, and the South China Seas. So most of the forts they built, which are still extant today, were built with Indian labor in those days. So very much so, the Indian presence was a presence all the way. Fast forward now to 1830s, 1848. When the Omanis were struggling with the Portuguese to wrest power back from them, it was a very great struggle in the Indian Ocean for 200 years. In the 19th century, the Sultan of Oman, who also acquired Zanzibar, decided now to move his capital to Zanzibar, at which stage he invited Indian traders to come and hold large, important administrative positions in his government, including his customs official, who was an Indian, he was a Gujarati. So that in a very, what we would call today a cosmopolitan vision, he brought the Indians to come and work in his island. And remember, at that time, there were already Indians in Zanzibar. In 1840s, there were almost 4,000 Ismailis there. Many of the traders, like Sataria Topan, Ali Dina Visram, Seva Haji Paru, the one or two others, they were all part of that trading community. So Indians were a presence already in Zanzibar much before the British arrived. Pira Devji was the other person, the name just escaped me. Now what happened is in 1885, you have the Berlin Conference, where the European powers decide to carve out large chunks of Africa for themselves. And in that whole process, the British gain a suzerainty over what is today Kenya and Uganda. And remember, Tanganyika was where the Germans were. And to protect their interest in Uganda, the British decided to build a railway line. When they decided to build a railway line, which Sir Charles Eliot calls the lunatic line, they decided to now employ indentured labor from India. 7,500 people were indentured to come to work to build the railway line. And this is part of the Girmit system. You know, with the same indentures that took people to Mauritius, took people to Guyana, took people to Trinidad, to South Africa. This is part of the indenture system. Out of the 7,500 Indians, a very small amount went back. I think about 2,000 went back. But a lot of them remained behind, and many of them were even killed by the lions. I think 39 of them were killed by the lions while they were building the railway. Now the British wanted to protect their interest in Uganda, so they built the railway line, which started the whole process of legitimate trade. On the back of that, many Indians came into East Africa, and the only thing they were allowed to do was take part in the retail economy and the lower echelons of economics, politics, whatever. The colonial society in East Africa was very highly stratified. You had the whites on the top, you had the Indians in the middle, you had the Africans at the bottom. And this entire pyramidical racial structure was reinforced by social, residential, economic, educational, and academic segregation. So highly segregated racial pyramid was the society on the eve of independence. And the Indians were not only in the distributive trade, which was the first point of attack for them, but Indians were also in professions. They owned property, they were in small businesses, but they were not at the commanding heights of the economy of East Africa at the time.
Thank you so much for that really interesting history of this long-standing labor mobility as well as these mercantile mobilities of the region, even as rulers are changing, and also how these mobilities become transformed into new professions in East Africa. So I wonder then, what changes took place after formal decolonization? Was there a palpable change to how people began to live their day-to-day lives? And did it force them to think about how they might not belong in ways that they had imagined, or alternatively, where they might belong in new and different ways?
Yes, I think that I did not touch on the Asians' role in politics at that time, and maybe I think I should just touch on that so it will sort of fill in what you are saying.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Indians were not really involved in politics as such, or Asians were not involved in politics as such. But I must qualify that in Kenya, in the early 1900s, they were pulled into the political mobilization process because when you moved from slave trade to a legitimate, so-called legitimate economy, the Indians were credited with introducing the monetary economy to the subsistence areas of East Africa. That is the reality. Now, it was in the early 20th century when the white British settlers were called in to develop the agriculture of the area, they decided to keep the Indians out of owning any land at all. That's where you have, in the 1920s, people like A.M. Jivanji, people like Hussein Suleiman Birji, who started the East African National Congress, East African Indian National Congress, very much in what Gandhi had done in South Africa. And on the back of that process was critical, because if it wasn't for that process, the whites would have declared Kenya a white man's colony. It was the Indians who can be credited for stopping that. But the argument would be, did the Indians do that for themselves, or did they do it for the Africans? But what should not be forgotten at the time, that the Indians were the agency through which African political aspirations were articulated. And Indians did produce people like Ishwar Das, Makan Singh. These are national politicians. Though they were not representing Indian political interests, they were national, because Ishwar Das accompanied Kenyatta to England in 1929 to fight for African political rights, particularly land rights. But now, at the time of independence, what was the role, what was happening in East Africa? Was there a palpable change? Am I right that that's what you are asking me to throw some light on?
That's exactly right. I was wondering how people felt about these changes.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question, and interesting even more so that we're having this discussion today, because today, the 15th of June, literally is 61 years to the day that I was on the Indian Ocean on a boat coming to East Africa on the eve of independence, as it were. And what did East Africa look like at that time? Well, it was euphoria, it was exciting. You know, there was excitement because Kenyatta had been released from prison. There was great expectation, but at the same time, there was fear. There was uncertainty. There was uncertainty because there was a change in the atmosphere. Nobody knew what was going to happen. And because of the atrocities that the British government had meted out during that struggle post-Mau Mau, people wondered, will we see a revenge? Will we see bloodshed? Will we see expulsions big time? I think Kenyatta's main job at that time was to assuage the feelings of the whites largely, that don't leave, build the country, join us. There'll be forgiveness and reconciliation. But at the same time, there was rising expectations, because all that pent-up anger and the concomitant rise of expectation, there was now a weaponization of race in the atmosphere. That they say Indians have all the money. That should be what they should now hive off to the Africans. So the whole question is that Africans were told, by unscrupulous politicians that immediately after independence comes, you see the corner shop that belongs to the Indian, that will be yours. Everything he has will be yours, both in economic terms and social terms. And I think that created a tremendous feeling of discomfort and a feeling of insecurity. Now, the insecurity the feeling of change was palpable in a particular way. I had come in 1962 purely from outside, but I began to see Nairobi's Indian flavor beginning to attenuate, not in a pluralistic way of being embraced, but in a much less pluralistic way of being alienated, being reduced. And I do recall one day I was on a bus to downtown Nairobi, and as I was moving, I heard an absolutely beautiful tune sung by Lata Mangeshkar from the film Avara. And I listened to it very intently, and I suddenly realized that what she was singing was a lovely love song saying, now the night is about to end. The color of the moon is fading. The atmosphere is restless and full of pain. And every time I hear that song, I begin to realize that it was a very moment in my own existence where there was a feeling of sadness, that I was beginning to see something in my life dying in terms of being instead of being inclusive in the new world that was coming, I saw that something was beginning to be lessened. And I think that was palpable. It was palpable at the time.
It's very interesting how what is happening globally, Afro-Asian solidarities that was so key in the lead up to decolonization are struggling as new nation states are coming into being. And it's remarkable how intimately this is felt even in one's everyday life in the 1960s. 70s. But I've also always thought it's really remarkable how much literature of a very high academic caliber, deep introspective work, whether it's Jagdish Singh Mangat's History of Asians in East Africa, or scholarly work such as the edited collection by Dharam Ghai that brings together multiple scholars. I think it's a Portrait of a Minority, it's called. Brings people together to reflect on the wider community's position in East Africa. And they're not the only ones. The Indian High Commissioner is it Kenya? It's Prem Bhatia?
Kenya, yes.
Yes, is also writing about the position of Indians, I think is what he's writing about, Indian ordeal in Africa. So there's a real understanding that there's a lot of reflection going on about the position of Asians in East Africa, both by Indians, but by East African Asians themselves. And what do you think that understanding was?
Ria, it's a very interesting period in which those documents came out. Let me give you a context again. East Africa became independent over a 4-year period. 1961, Tanganyika, 1962, Uganda, 1963, Zanzibar, and Kenya. So keep that time frame in mind. That over a 4-year period, 360,000 Asians are in these 4 countries, and they are very much branded in the same way. Dukavalas, not allowing space for the Africans to participate in the economy. Now that is a very sort of a broad generalization, but that's the way Asians were talked about. Not that Asians were not in the commanding positions professionally. I mean, for doctors, some of the best lawyers in the country at the time were Asians. Achuru Ram Kapila was the most brilliant criminal lawyer in East Africa. He was part of the Kenyatta defense team. People like, I forgot his name now, but there were some outstanding Indian lawyers in the country. There were doctors, opticians, surgeons. So Indians were a mixed bag. But remember that 1963, 1961, 1962, 1963, 1964, generally the African governments were carving out their own vision of what they saw a post-colonial society to look like, which was centrist, centralist, one-party systems, governments having the commanding heights of the economy where they could take hold of that, and therefore by nature the Indian dukawala or the Indian retailer had to be squeezed out. That was the general pattern. Now remember, there were 2 years moratorium. Each of the governments gave the Indians who were British subjects, or the Asians to be clear according to my own categorization, they told the Asians that by default you are British subjects. You have 2 years in which to decide to become citizens of the respective countries. But what was the backdrop? The backdrop is Tanzania goes the route of socialism, so they're going to nationalize properties. Uganda, internal difficulties, not sure. Kenya has a broadly capitalistic approach. They're going to use the mechanism of trade licensing. They're going to use the mechanism of Africanization. Now, Africanization at that time meant Africanization jobs for people who were black. It was a known factor. The government couldn't do that openly. It was the reality. So the situation was, that was the backdrop against which Indians had to decide whether they're going to become citizens or not. Now, during that time also, you would have responsible members of the Kenyan government. I mean, I was in Kenya at the time, so I can mention that every time an Indian tried to do something, an Asian tried to do something for African orphans or African philanthropic projects, the government would sort of be quite dismissive in some cases by saying, well, this is cocktail integration. You people are not really sincere. There was no general approach to bring about a rapprochement in my submission that would give the Indians a sense that, look, we are trying to make some endeavors to come closer. And the Asians were not a homogeneous group. I mean, there were different groups. There were Ismailis, there were Punjabis, there were Luanas, there were Gujaratis, there were Parsis, there were Goans. They were a mixed bag. Number one. Number two, when you have inflammatory speeches of this kind, people began to feel a little worried. Then there were other political movements like the mutiny in Zanzibar 4 or 6 weeks after independence, where a lot of Indians were killed. And a lot of people who participated or integrated in the community, like the Arabs, were killed. So that was the background. Now to come to the two documents you're mentioning. Portrait of a Minority was by 6 scholars, edited by very outstanding Indian academicians, Dharamgai and Yashkai, both of whom are alive but are very old at this time. The book was not a brilliant piece of work because when it was reviewed, people said academically it still had weaknesses A, B, and C. Personally, I've read the book 4 times over 50 years, and I think it was an extremely good piece of work. Because for the first time, it gave the Indian Asian community a picture to look at themselves. I don't know how many people read it, but it actually gave them a picture of the economic, the academic, and their educational profiles. What were their weaknesses, what the government was going to do, and what the Asians could perhaps do to integrate themselves into the new order that was developing. How many Asians read that book at the time? I'm not sure. I would think not too many, but at least it showed them what brought them to where they are and what might they expect to happen in the years to come. It ended on a quiet high note. Dharamgai ends the chapter with a lot of hope of what's going to happen. But what was the zeitgeist at that time? That the Asians had to give up the distributive economy. It was distributive economy is very, very complex. It's not a simple system that you just go and take over an Indian shop and you start making money. It didn't work that way. Asians worked on a very small margin. Entire family worked. They worked from 5 in the morning to 12 at night. It was a complex exercise at that level. Secondly, this was in 1965, closer to the deadline. And Prem Bhatia probably, in his book, very clearly outlines the realpolitik. The new dispensation was not interested on whether you had a defense committee for defense team for Kenyatta or whether Nehru gave so many scholarships to Africans who were fighting for independence. All the Pan-Africanist ideology was not that strong, particularly in Kenya, where the new government was busy strengthening a new middle class, a new bourgeoisie, and the land that the British government financed to be purchased by the Kenya government from the settlers was giving rise to new dispensations. So this whole idea of a pan-African Asian ideology was not that strong at the time. I mean, people just felt that, look, this is the reality. You got to live with it. You Asians better come up with something. And as far as the Asians were concerned, the old Gujarati phrase, you talk to somebody, they'll say, "Betha che, pera che, we are sitting, we're okay." Bagad said to Jaso, if they throw us out, we'll go. Kyaini jai to India, Jaso. If you don't go anywhere, we'll go to India. Nakar England, Jaso. That's the type of discourse. People were quite happy until Amin came and interestingly did something without thinking that put everybody on the road to thinking. All the governments who didn't think before, United Nations and the Indians started thinking. Because when Amin came, whatever he did, it was unthought. Amin just gave the edict. That's the background.
This is also a period of great upheaval across the entire continent of Africa. You've got the Congo crisis unfolding from the 60s. In the 60s, there are uprisings after independence across East Africa, Zanzibar in 1964, for example. And in the south of Africa, you've got 30 years of struggle. In Namibia, in South Africa, in Rhodesia, and you've also got struggles in Mozambique. Multiple empires are collapsing. Is this a different situation? What is the geopolitics in the wider? What is the perception of geopolitics in this wider arena? And does this impact on the experiences of Asians in East Africa as well?
Well, geopolitics, I think, played out in 5 levels. For the Indians. Within the context of our discussion, I think geopolitical had 5 levels at which Indians were either observers or very, very keen observers. Number 1 was at the personal security level. 1960, you had the Congo crisis, and a lot of people died. It was a very existential, basic issue that the Belgian government was there to evacuate their people. What happens to the Indians or the Asians? Which government will come and take them away? That was a very real issue. Who's going to look after us? That was a simple question people asked. Number 2, politics played a role in the emancipation of Southern Africa, as you mentioned, because Angola, Mozambique, Rhodesia, Northern Rhodesia, Southern Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, South Africa, Namibia. The Soviet Union, China, and the United States and European powers were all implicated in a struggle that was going to take another 30 years to unfold. So the Western powers were involved in a geopolitical drama that was very much based on the problem of Africa now was in the road to emancipation with the wind of change. Yet for the next 30 years, there were going to be these different problems of survival and dispensation. Don't forget, Nelson Mandela was just going to prison at that time. For another 30 years, he was going to be in solitary confinement, etc., etc. Thirdly, you had geopolitics playing a role in the Kenya government itself. If you read William Atwood's book, The Reds and the Blacks, the Kenyan government had an internal cleavage between the president and the vice president, depending on which particular camp they belonged to. So politics played a very important role in the very incipient stages of nation building, particularly in Kenya. Then the question of what type of ideology affected East Africa. President Nyerere decided we will take the road of socialism. So Tanzania had the philosophy of Ujamaa, village service, no amassing of property, one-party system, command economy, parastatals taking over. So that would affect the Dukawala too, because he'll say, look, is this what's going to happen to us in Kenya? And lastly, geopolitics also played a role in change of regime. I mean, Idi Amin was a classic example of a regime change. We may not want to put it in those terms, but exactly that's what happened. So you could see geopolitics playing itself out at a number of levels, and it did affect the local Dukawala, to decide whether he's going to remain there and keep the lights on with this little shop in Ambarara or Jinja or the smallest places of East Africa, or whether he goes to England and eventually buys a corner shop, which would create the infrastructure for his children to become, bank executives one day. And this is very interesting. Our Prime Minister's parents come from that background. Rishi Sunak's people come from that background, and so does Obama's family. It's very interesting. The two heads of state, one of America and one of Britain, their parents were involved in this whole system, I'm telling you, 60 years ago.
You've already alluded to this a bit, that Idi Amin forced people to think about something, where they might go. And then with the geopolitical situation, for example, the question raised in Belgium, who's going to evacuate Asians the way the Belgians evacuate them? So to rewind a little bit then, all of these new nation states that come into being give the Asians possibilities of many different offers of citizenship. So of what passport they might want to hold and what documents they want to hold. How did people choose which citizenship to have? Did they choose at all? And how did the states involved, whether it's East African states, the UK, whether it's India or Pakistan, approach this question of citizenship for this diaspora group with so many claims in one sense, but perhaps no claims in another?
Your question presupposes that people had a choice. I think 60 years ago, 50 years ago, people wouldn't have even thought of that question. Forget having a choice. The situation was very simple in the sense that people had no choice. If you took an average family, the mother may have kept her Indian passport if she had Indian citizenship. The father would not have taken local citizenship or may have, and the children had no papers at all. Now, this was the situation with many, many people. And I will give you one or two examples. I mean, I met a chap in France called Chitalia. And I said, what name is this? Is it a family name? Is it a Gujarati name? Is it a Punjabi name? What is it? And he said, no, it's my grandmother's first name. So I said, how did you get your grandmother's first name? He said, the United Nations picked us up. We had no papers. And all we had was a document with my grandmother's name called Chitalia, and it had some stamp on it. So they said, all right, you all are Chitalias. We'll use that paper to grant you some sort of a position to stay. Now take another situation. Take a guy called Ashok Natwani, a good friend of mine, who had a Uganda passport. He had opted for Ugandan citizenship within the 2 years. And he got a scholarship to study at Nairobi University. He was an engineer. When this happened, he went to verify his citizenship. He was standing on the line. When he gave this to this woman there, he said, I just want to verify that if my citizenship is still authentic because I want to come and work here. I owe the government this obligation. And the woman took the passport, went inside the office, came back, took a pair of scissors and cut it on 4 sides and gave it back to him. Said, you are stateless. You're no longer a Ugandan citizen. But he said, look, I was educated by the Ministry of Education. To which the woman answered, but that's education and this is immigration. So this poor Ashok had nowhere to go. So the next morning, he's waiting on a line for the Canadian embassy to open. Somebody taps him on his back and says, look, there's a very big queue here. Why don't you go over the road? The Australians are taking some people. They just opened an office. So he changes queues and he goes to the Australian office, which opened half an hour earlier. So the Australian guy says, yes, we'll take you, but you need to make a decision immediately. So he says, this is my girlfriend. I want to take her with me. He said, we don't take girlfriends, we take wives. So he says, what should I do? He said, go across the road, swear an affidavit that you're married to her or you're going to marry her or whatever. So he gets his affidavit and he signs up. So he ends up eventually in Australia. So you could see the situation of fragility with no real clarification of where you belong, who you belong to, or whether you even belong. People didn't know whether they even belong when they had already taken up citizenship. And that was the case of 6,000 Ismailis, 6,500 Ismailis. They'd all taken citizenship immediately after independence. Whereas Idi Amin said, well, on a technical ground, none of you belong here. So it was a question of where do we belong? Do we belong? Can we belong? And that was the problem. And that was the reality of people right across the board.
It seems there are so many big political and legal decisions being made on behalf of East African nations. I know for a fact, for example, that lawyers in the UK at the UN, they're debating whether these people are British subjects, whether they are automatically made stateless, do they belong in India, who takes responsibility for them. And at the ground, you're describing these crazy bureaucratic contingencies. What line is short? What does the person behind the counter suggest that you do? What options are available to you? All of this suggests that decisions are being made for them, for this wider population. But where do you think East African Asians saw themselves as belonging? Was it in India? Was it somewhere in the West? Was it in East Africa?
1963, 64, 65, 66, 67, 68, 69, I don't think Indians in East Africa saw India as their home. I don't think so. I think they saw going forward as home. That means when you don't go back to India, you go back to the West. Did they see Britain as the home? The story was always that in Britain you have to put money into a meter when it's cold. If you don't put a shilling in the meter, you'll freeze to death. So as far as people were concerned, they said, look, we'll sit it out until they throw us out. And I think it was a phased sort of development where people were being phased out. Now, there was also a situation that did people think of Canada? I don't think anybody knew of Canada. Nobody in 69 that I'm aware of knew where Canada was. Part of our family had got in touch with some Canadian officials in Nairobi because we were South Africans. But Canada was not on the horizon in 69, really. And one particular event that should never leave my mind was on one morning during those 90 days. I went to the Nairobi Law Court to fight a case. I picked up a newspaper. It was not a national newspaper. And I saw a photograph of an Indian woman talking to an Indian High Commission official on the platform. Photograph taken off the train with window. And there's another window with a lot of men looking out of the window. Some of them I remember, were turban Sikhs. And the headline was, they are being transported on the railways their ancestors built, and they're being taken back to the Indian Ocean. They don't know where they're going. And I looked at that photo and I was aghast. I just thought for a moment, I felt discombobulated. Is that the word? I just didn't know what was happening. And I walked down the road and I met an African-American paleontologist. I still remember his name, Eugene Harper Johnson. I said, Eugene, what is this all about? And he sort of thought he was assuaging my feelings. He says, well, that won't happen in Kenya while Kenyatta is alive. And then he looked at me rather sardonically and said, but we are dependent on the heartbeat of an ailing man. So I thought to myself, it was a Damascene moment. I said, look, what am I doing here, a South African, waiting in this queue? I mean, this is a long queue. I couldn't see any opening to the queue. Forget those who are British subjects, forget Canada and Australia and New Zealand and all that. I couldn't see the beginning of the queue, never mind the end of it. I didn't know where there was a queue for me to stand on. It was at that moment I began to realize that I don't think East Africa is a home for me. So that was the situation at the time. It was really as real as it could be.
You've talked about the place of race and economy and how they become conflated as a result of that colonial pyramid, what my colleague Shazan Mohammadi in Canada would call the colonial sandwich. And all of these various trade licensing and immigration acts, and of course, Amin's expulsion, were all promulgated in the name of access to resources for the African people of these new entities. What was the economic situation with relation to jobs, and was there a kind of hierarchy on the eve of the expulsions, and how is this playing out in real life experiences?
Well, it was very simple. The Zeitgeist at that time, the Zeitgeist was Africanization was the mantra. And Africanization meant Black Africans would get jobs. Understandably so. I don't think anybody made a big issue out of it. The question was that if you were not a citizen, would you get a work permit to do a job that a local citizen could do? Now, that was not articulated in racial terms, But in practical terms, it means that if you are a British subject, Asian or European, and there is a Black African person who can do that same job, then it will go to them. Then you would have gradations. There are certain jobs that if you're a brain surgeon, the country doesn't want to lose you. If you are a top economic consultant, they don't want to lose you. So you would get a work permit for a year or 18 months with the sponsoring organization told that look for a local person or train a local person. There were a lot of training programs. Now, any system of that nature also is amenable to a lot of corruption. And that did happen in East Africa. I don't want to pretend it didn't, but it was moving. So that was how the process was going. Now, when the Asians, if they said, well, the Africanization process is geared more towards Black African people getting jobs and not on meritocracy, the government's response is we're playing catch up. It's not going to be permanent. This is the transition. But how do you tell somebody this is a transition and lose their job? They don't have a work permit. They can't do any work. I myself was looking for a job as a lawyer. I couldn't get a work permit. There was a lawyer who helped me, an African lawyer and an Indian lawyer. But I remember the day they came to talk to me. They said, look, you are a very bright guy. We love you. And one of the persons in whose office I was working was an MP. But he said, look, this is the government regulation. We have no leeway. So I wasn't going to be sitting down and say, well, this is an equity that will take place over 2 years. I needed food on the table. So I could either work on the gig economy and get into trouble, or they could get into trouble. So that was the reality. So that was happening. And perhaps it would have worked its way out. But Uganda threw a new spanner in the works. It threw a new reality that was in the horizon. And that's how it worked out. I mean, over time, yes, more and more Africans got into the professions. But remember, you're talking about transition state. I mean, most of the professions were very much dominated by Indians and Europeans at that time. This probably had to happen. But the problem is that how do you make it happen without depriving one segment of the community who were historically placed in a vulnerable position and say, well, everything is fair in love and war. And there was nobody to talk with the Asian community. I mean, governments in Asia were not in a position or probably were not ready. There were various reasons.
Once it became clear that people had to leave, whether it was the slower squeeze of economic acts and measures or the abrupt order of expulsion, how did they leave East Africa? And did formal citizenship have a bearing on this? Or was it more about friends, colleagues, and contacts, existing networks really within East Africa that shaped how people were able to leave?
I think it was a little of both. You know, those who had British passports waited for the door to open. And like a little tap, the British government would open the tap and close it according to its capacity to absorb people from those colonies. As far as networks are concerned, what could Asians do for each other? I mean, give you an example of Canada. If you arrived 1 week early, 1 week later, you'd be a volunteer looking for a job for somebody else. So that's how the networks work. They said, come home, come and have a meal. We'll try and see if we can get you a job with a car washing agency. So networks did help, but the Asian networks 50 years ago were weak. They were weak. I mean, you couldn't get a job in Canada somewhere if you didn't have Canadian experience. If somebody is in motor car washing business, he'll tell his chief, I got a buddy, can you give him a job? Come home and come and stay with me for a week, I'll look after you. Today, if you talk of Asian networks, yeah, people have got businesses in Dubai and Ahmedabad and Texas and something in Vancouver, and they can give you a letter to work in a hotel somewhere. In those days, we didn't have that capacity. It's as simple as all that. Everybody was not like Madhwani or Mehta. Mehta and Madhwani are the commanding heights of the economy of Uganda. The others were basically professionals. You know, my case in point, I mean, I was a criminal lawyer at one time. I ended up at university in Canada on Saturday mornings. Yes, I worked. I used to sell things in the street, food for a hockey game. Now, at this time, a very interesting thing happened, and I must tell you about this, that two examples I'll give you that exemplify that. One is an example of two Ismaili boys who came to my office. One was going to London and the other one was going to Saskatchewan. They were buddies. And the Canadian guy said, come with me to Canada. But the English guy said, no, the guy who was going to London said, I've got a ticket for London. So when they came to see me, I phoned the British High Commission. I said, can you give this guy who's going to Canada a British visa so these two buddies can be together in England? And the lady at the British High Commission was very pleasant. I met her the previous night at the Law Society dinner. She said, we can't do it. So now this Johnny wants to go to Canada, but he's got a ticket and he's not going to get his refund. So he came to see me. And luckily, I was the lawyer to the travel agency. So I phoned up Sadru Ibrahim, who owned the travel agency. I said, Sadru Bhai, this poor chap is struggling. This is his last penny. He's bought a ticket. So Sadru, in a moment of generosity, said, give me the ticket. And he just endorsed it. He said, tell him to go to my office and just to pick up a Canadian ticket and tell him to tell the guy that not to worry. I've sanctioned it. Both these guys ended up in Saskatchewan. I believe they started a big car washing department. They made money years later. I never met them. But the important other anecdote, which I thought is classic, was that a former Attorney General of Uganda, Joshua Luyimbazi Zaki, one of the most highly educated men I've met in my life, turned up at our home at 6 o'clock one morning in overalls, and he had walked the border. And he asked my mother, where is my family? And my mother assuaged his fear and said, they're all safe. Dr. Zaki was being hounded by Amin's Gunda squad. We hid him in our house. And the irony is that a former Attorney General of an independent post-colonial black government comes to the home of displaced Indians from South Africa, who then are looking for a certificate of identity to allow him to get on the plane. And who do we go to? To the Indian High Commission. Look at the irony. We didn't get it from the Indian High Commission. They were sympathetic. They didn't give it for some reason. But look at the situation. And that's the time he told me and my sister, he said, don't remain in Africa. It's not for you. This was the reality. So there were so many people in this way, trying to engage networks. I mean, in my own case, I wrote to a friend in New Zealand, Sushil Patel, who was in a small town nobody's ever heard of called Tia Aroha. And I wrote to my other friend who was working in the Attorney General's office in Jamaica to see if they could take me in either of those places. How much is that different from the indentured labor system where boats take you either to Guyana or Fiji to Mauritius? I was prepared to go on the same indentured boat route just to look for a homeland. So that was the reality of the time. I don't think that today the Asians are in that same, psychologically in that same degree of vulnerability, but we were vulnerable. There's no other way to say it. We were very vulnerable, and that vulnerability has still traumatized many people. In my own family, I notice it. There is that feeling of fear. There's that feeling of holding on to every piece of document you've got and make 10 copies of it and all that. We become very sort of security obsessed, that tomorrow they'll put us on a boat or put us on a train or get us out of the country. That whole idea of expulsion is very much part of our psyche.
Mohammed, I've asked you this before in a casual conversation, but I'm going to take this opportunity to ask you this in greater detail, because you've talked about networks, you've talked about travel agents, you've talked about writing to your friends, but we've also talked about this race, capital, and economy. So I was also wondering if very briefly, if you might be able to tell us how people were able to pay for these journeys when their economic resources were what these policies were after, really.
You know, there was a system in East Africa at the time called MCOs. You could go to a travel agent, pay the travel agent money in Kenya, and buy what is known as a miscellaneous charges order that would allow you to buy tickets wherever you went in the world. So it was like a coupon. And I know I bought MCOs myself. When I hived off my legal practice, whatever money I got, my brother said, put it in MCOs so that you can come home. If nothing happens, you can come back to Kenya. So people who had cash money either bought tickets. Iqbal Asaria's father was a millionaire in the garment industry, in the textile industry. He said we had so much money and we couldn't take more than 50 pounds out of the country. So he said we bought MCOs for about 50 families so that they could get out if they wanted to. So you couldn't buy MCOs for £250,000, but each family could buy MCOs for about 2 or 3 tickets. That's number one. Number two, wherever they ended up, they probably had enough. They may have had a sandwich in their pocket. They probably had a bottle of water. When they were on the plane, when the stewardess would come and said Coca-Cola or tea, if you said yes and it cost $1, in those days $1 was worth about 40 shillings. So the parents would nudge the child, say, don't ask for it. We've got a bottle of water in this thing. So the reality was that there was no resources, but there was resourcefulness. What I would call they were resourceful. They were no resource rich, people were resourceful. Secondly, there were families where 15, 20 people got together, all sleeping in the same living room, people working twice the shift. People had to do with what they had. You had nothing more. You could only do with what you had. So people managed to survive.
You've talked about this feeling of fear and what everyone carries with them, this worry about their papers holding them close, as well as the worry that they'll have to leave again. But do you think many East African Asians felt that they would one day be able to return to their countries? What's been your experience? Have you been back? Have many others gone back?
I've been back a few times, but I've been back to South Africa. I've been back to India. I went to my village in Chotila in Western India, and our family helped to build a well that my great-grandfather had built about 120 years ago. People always leave the country they leave with the wish to return. I mean, what is that famous story about Chopin when he was leaving? He took a little piece of Poland's soil, put it in a bottle and carried with him when he went to Paris. So it's a myth of return. There is a British of Pakistani origin called Muhammad Anwar who's written the book, The Myth of Return. Tomorrow is a different country. You never really return to what you leave. Number one. Number two, the next generation that grew up, particularly, I can speak about the Ismaili community in Canada, but this is true with many other communities, non-Ismaili communities everywhere. Their children did much better than they could even ever imagine. The families who didn't even have money, they found themselves in a situation by leveraging their social capital. Their children became brain surgeons. One of the leading world brain surgeons today is in Ottawa called Amin Qasim. He does brain surgery with both his hands. Somebody asked him, where did you learn this? He said, I was the son of a motor mechanic. My father taught me how to use 2 spanners at the same time. So you found that kids did much better than their parents could ever imagine for themselves. Now, if you go to those kids today and say, you ought to go back to Uganda, they're going to say, look, for what? A holiday? Yes, we'll go for a holiday. They're not going to go for any other reasons generally. So a person like Shafiq Pirani, the son of an education administrator, was thrown out when he was 2 years old. He mastered a certain technology on repairing clubfoot without surgery, and he brought that technology back to Uganda, to Mulago Hospital, and it was applied to 10,000 children over a period of time. So some of those people went back for those type of projects. Very few people went back again to claim their properties. Some of them went back and became very big in business, in banking, in IT. The Madhwanis and the Mehtas came back in a different shape. And to quote Muljibai Madhwani, when I met him, Manubai Madhwani was the most wonderful human being. Manubai told me, he said, Muhammad, we've come here because we've come back to something we could have never imagined. We didn't even understand what our full potential was. He said, we've been able to fulfill more than ever what we thought we'd do. But that's very small, very small amount of people. The bulk of the people never went back. There was a chap called Amir Jetta, who was fascinating. He said when he was leaving, he was going to Denmark, he didn't know where to put the key of his pharmacy. So he put it on the top of the ledge of his pharmacy, thinking one day he'll come back and he'll find the key to open the door. But there was no pharmacy whenever he went back. I don't think he even went back. So that is the reality, that once you, like Heraclitus says, you never jump into the same river twice. There was no river anymore. There was not the same person. Everybody became something different. And so if they went back, they're going to go back in different shape, if at all. But that is the reality.
Mohammed, you've been an observer of the Asian African diaspora for over 50 years now. You've written a book on Indians in South Africa. You travel fairly often to Malaysia and to other countries across Asia and Africa. And most of all, this history of displacement and of expulsion and of diaspora is very much your own. Do you think this history, what happened in Uganda, what happens with the trade licensing acts across East Africa and as well as with the immigration and citizenship acts, do you think that can happen again? And what do you think this history means for other diasporic communities across the world, whether descended from indentured labor or from labor and mercantile mobilities?
The global situation has changed dramatically. I mean, over the last 50 years, the world has changed very much. If you ask me, could Uganda happen again? My immediate feeling is not in the same form. But remember, Indian communities in settler colonies are living at a fault line. So if you ask me that this is an earthquake-prone area, is my house safe? I can tell you, you won't have the same earthquake, but you will have tremors. And I think that we need to be clear that the ride forward is not an easy one. We've seen what's happened in South Africa. We've seen what's happened in Fiji. We've seen what's happened in Guyana. We've seen what happened in Trinidad. And remember Botswana, South Africa, Namibia, Mauritius, Madagascar, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Fiji, Grenada. These are all areas where you've had former settler colonies. There are a number of countries where people, unscrupulous politicians, will play the race card. They may play race with religion. That's happening in certain diasporic countries. They may play race with class, possibly happening in South Africa. So we're on the fault line. How do Indians want to see themselves in those communities is the question I would ask. Do they want to see themselves in just as a group that are there to make money, while a large part of the people are going without facilities? Would the Indians want to live an ostentatious life? Would they like to be seen as being part of a vibrant civil society? Would they play a critical role in the democratic process, or will they say we're going to only make money and we won't bother? I think these are all important issues. And importantly enough, these type of discourses are important for Indians to understand, or Asians to understand, the contribution they've made historically. What contribution did Charlie Jagan make in Guyana? What contributions were made in Trinidad? What contributions were made in Fiji? What contributions were made in South Africa? I think that they need to be aware of their historical contribution, but not to just rest on those, but to be seen to be participating in a much bigger civil society encounter. Otherwise, the old story that Frantz Fanon, a great theorist of post-colonialism, always said, that if the initial freedom movement is not socialistic in its conception, then the group that is seen as having the money or the resources will always be scapegoated. I think the Asian minorities in 19 former settler colonies, or whatever the number is, need to understand what is their stake in the societies in which they are, and what type of modus vivendi, what type of compact that they come across, because there are multidimensional difficulties. In some cases, Asians are seen askance by indigenous populations like Fiji. In other places, the clashes between Asians and Africans, or Asians and blacks who came as slaves. So there are those fault lines that could be easily manipulated in a globalized world. You know that the globalized world is not an easy world. Even in developed democracies, we are fragile. And I think we need to understand the politics of fragility, the politics of vulnerability, the politics of inclusivity, and the politics of survival. I think that's where I would end my case.
Thank you so much, Mohammed, for so patiently answering all of these questions and painting this vibrant picture of, vibrant and complex picture of post-colonial state building, of race, of class, and also of an irreconcilable conflict, but one that is fundamentally happening in that moment of post-colonial hope. I'm going to hand over to Dr. Fayaz Mughal to make a few concluding remarks.
Ria, thank you very much. Mohammed, thank you very, very much. An amazing, highly insightful, highly thoughtful discussion from you both. So I wanted just to thank you, first of all, for giving an insight into areas we have not really seen a lot of insight from other programs of work. And I think this information that you have provided today is absolutely essential in getting a greater depth of understanding around what took place pre-expulsion and then post-expulsion. Now, I just wanted to pick up some key points here. I was struck by the numbers of those Indians in East Africa, 360,000 you mentioned in the numbers, around 4 or 5 countries around the time of independence. And that's a very significant large number that were related and engaged with colonial Britain as well as colonial powers. 360,000 Indians. I think you struck a really strong chord by saying Indians were not a homogenous group. So there was a lot of fragmentation within, but they were linked by where they came from, culture and language. And I think it's important, both Ria and Mohammed, the comments you made around the expulsion in the context, looking at the expulsion in the context of independence and the Africanization policies of jobs for Africans around that time. We can't get away from the intertwining of the independence movements in Africa and the impacts on policymaking around Africanization and the potential strong links to further expulsion of Indians down the line. That is a given now, given the chain reaction that was taking place across Africa from independence, etc. You also make the point, Mohammed, very strongly of the marginalization in the economy. Indians mainly active in the retail industry. Marginalization in the sense of, well, they were not actually spread across the industry. They didn't have the buffer and they didn't have the ability to be resilient when they were effectively taken out of the economy because they were in just one segment predominantly, which made them more vulnerable in their economic penetration in the country. And then, Ria, you mentioned the issue of the Congo crisis, the Zanzibar conflict, Namibian conflict, Rhodesia, all of these issues happening in a wider Africa that was seeing the winds of change, not just independence, but the winds of conflict as well. And the geopolitics being played out, the geopolitics around the Soviet Union, the United States, the issue of the impact of communism around the 60s and 70s cannot also be detentacalized from what took place in Africa. So we have the issue around independence, the issue around conflict, and the issue around communism and capitalism, and Africa being a staging ground for that frontier between the two dynamics in the 60s and 70s. All of these had connections from this talk today as to where expulsion eventually ended up. And Mohammed, you talked about the fragility of identity around the Ugandan Asian population and in fact, the Indian population in East Africa, the fragility. And I was struck by that. The fact that actually, if they were kicked out, and as you said, many said, well, when we're kicked out, we'll wait and see. We'll kind of go to the West or we'll go to India. But it was that sense of fragility, of lack of direction that actually ended up with them having a crisis when expulsion actually took place. A crisis of direction, a crisis of identity, a crisis of belonging. And I know from my personal background that identity and belonging have plagued me much of my life and plagued my family after the expulsion from Uganda. So we have carried the after effects of the fragility of identity And it's become, to some degree, intergenerational, at least in the first generation, post-expulsion. I wanted to also just pick up the issue around where the issue of belonging took place. I've talked about identity, but belonging. And Mohammed, you made very clear the fact that also, looking back, many of those from Uganda and the Ugandan Asians have also realized now that they have gained some potential. There are some real benefits that they have gained by the expulsion, that actually they have reached points of their potential they never knew existed. But they carry with them also the loss. That there are gains, but there are losses. For some, they lost everything. For some, they lost their sense of who they were. For some, they gained a quite neurotic tendency towards securitization. You know, my mother was very, very neurotic on securitization all her life, checking locks, checking where her passport is, multiple copies of passports, Mohammed. You mentioned she had unknown copies hidden around the house. I was like, Mum, this is getting obsessive. And it was a case, she was always saying, where am I going next? She may not have vocalized it, but it was subconscious in her mind. And I think you have starkly mentioned the issue of trauma. With the expulsion came trauma, psychic trauma that many carried with them in little behavior patterns that they carried across and then possibly even passed on to the next generation, little behavior patterns. And I'm going to finish off by saying that you struck me, Mohammed, when Ria asked you a question, it struck me really prominently that this family on the plane saying to their child, you know, if the air hostess comes across with a Coke or with a drink, don't ask for it because it will cost us money and we've got nothing. But we have that bottle of water that was given to us when we left, expelled out the country. And that I wrote this down. You said they had no resources, but plenty of resourcefulness. And I'm going to end on that point because I think it sums up this population. And it also sums up the sense of why many of them are still around, why we're still here, and why they can't get rid of us. It's because we're a resourceful bunch. And I'll end with that. Thank you so much, Ria and Mohammed. Fantastic.
Thank you for watching this discussion. To find out more about the project From East to West, the history of Ugandan Asians and the other work we are doing, please head to our website, www.ugandanasians.com.
Ravan, thank you. Mohammed was very powerful. That was a complete...
Why settle for these 2 dimensions? Yeah! When you can have 3! A decade ago, the marketing machine behind 3D TV was so strong that even we got caught.
Yes, as I was saying, Mohammed, that was a very powerful interview. And your anecdotes were so very informative. Thank you so much. So what I would like to lead into now would be Ms. Lata Desai. She also is part of our program, and she is here with us to join us with some remarks. So Lata, let me start with you with regard to your resettlement stories. And I know you've conducted numerous interviews.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for inviting me today. I have to say, Dr. Kishoji gave a wonderful insight into the whole history of our journey to Britain. And I have been involved in a couple of projects, really exploring what happened to this diasporic community. And your question about what happened to the Ugandan Asians after they were expelled to Britain, I would direct you all to our website, bua50.org, where we have conducted interviews, spoken to numerous people, almost more than 40 people, and each one had a very interesting story to tell. But the gist of what they told us was obviously a lot of hardships in the beginning. Weather was the first thing. They came from a tropical climate all the way to Britain, cold autumn, winter's day where they did not have any clothes. Food was also a problem, cultural issues, and remember they were expelled with just one suitcase and 50 pounds to spend. Now, there is of course, there was a lot of racial tension at that time, but also the wonderful work which the Ugandan Resettlement Board did in creating these resettlement camps for these Ugandan Asians was something quite unique, because they set up about 16 resettlement camps all over the country, and they housed these expellees in them, where they gave them a shelter, food, gave them a chance to apply for jobs. WRVS, mainly the voluntary organizations, supported these expellees. And talking to all of these people after 50 years, I have found that they were immensely grateful to the support which these people gave them. And today they still reflect on all those wonderful things which had happened to them, despite all the racial tension. And, it was not easy for them to settle in Britain. But now looking back 50 years down the line, as Dr. Keshavji and Dr. Fias Mughal also said, that of course it was Britain's gain, Uganda's loss, but at the same time they also have been through a very traumatic period, and now everybody's reflecting about what happened. I mean, was there something which we did not do right? There is a lot of reflection amongst the Ugandan Asians, saying that were there any issues of us not integrating with the Ugandans, native Ugandans? Were there any lessons learned? So there are lots of numerous questions which are still to be kind of discussed. And all I would say is that people have, this has been a story of triumph over adversity. They really worked hard, and now you see so many successful people in Britain, Canada, everywhere else. So the resilience of our community is something which has to be celebrated.
Thank you for that. Your resilience is absolutely right, to be celebrated. And I love that comment where people were not resource rich, but resourceful. That really is a very powerful statement. So thank you so much. Are there any questions that any of our members would like to ask? Lata? You can feel free to raise your hands. I know there were someone I know Betty Govindan, you were making some comments on the chat. Would you like to add to that?
I think that Mr. Vinod Taylor wanted to say a few words earlier, I saw on the chat. And also, I think Jay Nair had made one or two comments. And please feel free to comment or to ask or to observe or whatever you wish. It's I've spoken for a long time, but I would hear anyone who can see one hand is up there, David Clark.
David, would you like to speak? And then Vinod, I know you're Ugandan born also, and you wanted to share your experience. Are you still here with us? I wonder if he left. David, go ahead. David, are you able to hear us? Okay, Jay, you want to go ahead? We'll see if we can get David in a. All right. Raven, are they able to unmute?
Well, we can see three
Yeah,
hands up, but
problems to unmute.
yeah. Is there a problem with unmuting yourselves?
Raven,
Yes.
are you able to help
Got
them?
it. Got it.
Okay, Jay, go ahead.
Hey, Mohammed, what a
Hi there.
what a
How is
discussion.
the situation in East Africa different from that of West Africa?
Okay, sure. Let's take one question at a time. Jay, was that your question? Or is
No,
that a question of someone else's?
No,
That-
not mine.
Okay, shall we take the question of West Africa and East
Okay,
Africa?
with my question, what is the difference between in the incident situation between East and West Africa?
Okay, am I understanding your question correctly? That what was the situation of the Asians in West Africa as opposed to East Africa? Is that the question?
Yes, West and East Africa, the presence in the Asian population, in the Indian population. That is correct.
I'm not understanding. Could you help me to understand the question?
Yes, what is the difference in the East Indian situation between East and West Africa?
Okay, thank you. I got it now. Thank you so much. Historically, the bulk of the Indian population in Africa is found on the east coast of Africa. South Africa, Mozambique, what was Tanganyika, Kenya, Uganda, Belgian Congo, Rwanda, Burundi. It was that area where the indentured Indians and the passenger Indians came to settle. West Africa has a very, very small Indian population comparatively. There are Indian people who went to West Africa, but they didn't go as part of the original British indentured system. To my knowledge, there was a small Indian community in Ghana. They were very well integrated, but it was a very small community. I think West Africa had more of a Lebanese business community. Ghana, Nigeria has a very strong Lebanese expatriate community who were in the economic segment very prominently. We don't hear too much of Indians in West Africa. And I've been to Abidjan in the Ivory Coast. I have not been to Ghana, not been to Nigeria. But generally, when you talk of the Asians in Africa today, you're talking of the countries like Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Zanzibar, Botswana, Malawi, South Africa, Namibia, and most recently Angola, and of course Mozambique. That was where the Indian concentration in Africa was largely situated. So West Africa didn't have the same problem that I mentioned with East Africa, though political independence came to those countries at the same time. 1957, 1958, 1959, 1960, West African countries began to become independent. And you know, Kwame Nkrumah had a very strong presence in Africa at that time. Any other questions? I see 3 more hands. I see Jay, you've got your hand up still, and I've got Mr. Sukdeo, your hand is up too. So might you unmute yourself? And Shakira, this is your job as the moderator. I don't want to take over.
No, that's okay. I'm trying to get Robin to see if I can get them to unmute. Jay, are you able to unmute? Right, Vinod is back. Good. I know
Lovely,
Vinod.
lovely.
I'm unmuted. Oh, David Clark again. Is
I
David
think we
going
can
first?
move on to the next question from Jay now, as you are unmuted. Shakira?
Okay, I'm unmuted. Can I go?
Go ahead, Jay.
Shakira?
Go ahead, Jay.
Yeah. Mohammed, what a dynamic presentation. And there's something that comes to mind. 72, after 72, the Indians were expelled from Uganda. And I came into Canada in 76. And part of that big gang came here. And part of the group of Ismailis ended up in Canada. I wonder if you remember that part?
I do.
And then that was because of the direction that Britain gave to the what you call Canadian government to take them in. And secondly, the Aga Khan and Pierre Trudeau were buddies. So I remember clearly, because I came in as a refugee too from South Africa, and I couldn't get what they got, because they've got a lot of things that were given by the government of Canada. With us, I came here saying that I'm not going to be dependent on the country. I want to build on my own self, because I was a qualified teacher, things like that. So quite a few of them came into Canada and settled and were very resilient. That's important, where they built their empires. And today we are richer because they've got the center, they've got the Aga Khan, museum in Toronto, and they've got settlements from coast to coast. And a lot of them are in politics, a lot of them are in government, and a lot of them are in the Senate of the country. So, and the parliament of the country. So they've settled here, and some of them, the business community, they went back. And some of them are still in Uganda, going back and forth. So they are, I have friends who are Ismailis, and they are moving.
So, okay. Go ahead, Jay, go ahead.
Somebody is trying to cut in.
Yes.
So what has happened, the friends of mine that I know spoke about going back and reclaiming the properties, reclaiming their possessions. I don't know how that is going. I'm not keeping ahead of it. It comes to mind of what's going to happen in South Africa. That is the next $1 million question, that if Mohammed or somebody from the panel could give us an answer.
Okay, let me try and put this in context. I was in Canada in 1976. I was at university at that time. Let me put the Aga Khan's role into context. When East Africa was becoming independent, a very, very large percentage of the Ismailis took citizenship immediately, because the Aga Khan's guidance to the Ismaili community in East Africa was, throw your lot with the countries, work towards its development, educate your children. And the Aga Khan himself was involved in the process of decolonizing the economy. Not that he was in charge of the governments, but the Aga Khan built all the schools that were multiracial. He built the first multiracial hospital in East Africa, contributed towards the education development, and also contributed to the industrial development of the countries. He set up the first free African press in Africa at that time. Now, the Ismailis coming to Canada was not the Aga Khan picking the phone up and telling Trudeau, take all these people. Basically, Canada was changing its policy of taking immigrants from non-traditional areas at the time. And Mike Malloy, the Canadian ambassador at one time, has spoken about this. Where the Ismaili sector came in very powerfully is that the Ismaili community had this network of working very closely together, where people got together at their centers, started taking people in their homes, trying to help each other to get jobs. And then the Aga Khan, very soon after the resettlement, the time when you came in, underwrote loans to Ismaili business people, where he told the two Canadian big banks, I think it was the Bank of Nova Scotia and the Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce, if I'm not mistaken, where he said that if you can increase the loans that you can give to Ismailis to get into business, then whatever is the shortfall in that loan, I will guarantee that. And so Ismailis became bankable and got into businesses, small businesses, you know. They all got into the segment of the economy because they were entrepreneurs, they had entrepreneurial skills. So I think it was the community as such that was the safety net for education, for getting people together, to helping people to do their CVs, to helping people to put their loans into the banks. That's number one. Number two, at a more international level, Prince Sadruddin Aga Khan was the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. And Prince Sadruddin leveraged the UN system, not only for the Ismailis, but to ensure that the 1951 refugee protocol, which was very Eurocentric, would now be widened to take in refugees from other parts of the world. In 1971, remember, was the Bangladesh crisis. Prince Sadruddin was in charge of the Bangladesh crisis, and he used a mechanism called the Good Office of the Secretary General's office to ensure that refugees who were stuck under the definition of the 1951 protocol could find alternative ways of getting to security. So I think that the Aga Khan, Prince Karim, and his uncle Prince Sadruddin played seminal roles in their own way, which was not the conventional way, but certainly was how leveraging, in the case of Prince Sadruddin, the United Nations system, which was for everyone, and in the case of the Aga Khan, using the Ismaili community as a self-help basis to get back into resettlement. Now, some Ismailis went back to Uganda, and interestingly enough, after the expulsion, the Aga Khan never stopped the Aga Khan network from operating in Uganda. It continued with schools, it continued all the way. And today it's now become part of the Aga Khan University. Again, the university is contributing to the development of Uganda. So I thought I'll just put that in context, Jay.
Good point. Yeah. Correct.
Fantastic. Okay, now we'll take Vinod Taylor and then Daryl Sukhdev afterwards. Vinod, go ahead.
Okay, so firstly, I would like to thank Mohammed Bhai for very eloquent delivery of discussion. And I'm also from Uganda, came to the age of 14 to the UK, and I resonate with many of the things that he said as a testimony to a lot of the things about my father who had a tailoring shop. We borrowed money from somebody to buy the air tickets to come to UK. So something Mohammed Bhai had mentioned. So I endorsed that. Yes, we borrowed money to come to UK, which we repaid later on to the people. I couldn't speak English, but I could read and write. Started my career as a cleaner and moved into banking as a chaiwala and moved forward. And in the context of the Britishness, I obviously have visited Uganda many a times, but do I call it a home? Would I want to live there again? I think it's very difficult having the children grown up here. Vis-a-vis India as well, it's very difficult to say that India is home. So UK is predominantly home for me. And I think the contribution as a banker, I used to finance a lot of Indian trades. And Mohammed Bhai, just to mention, when you talked about Nigeria and Ghana, the West Africa, so I used to finance a lot of Sindhi community. And the first of the Sindhis went to Sierra Leone in 1869. So there was Indian migration at the time to Sierra Leone and West Africa. So predominantly the Lebanese, yes, they were very much into businesses in Nigeria, Ivory Coast, and Ghana and other countries. But the Sindhi community did very well. Gujarati communities were not so many in those countries. There were some diamond merchants who were based in Ghana and are still based in Ghana, and some of the gold dealers are still based in Ghana because western coast being the Gold Coast of Africa. In terms of this insecurity, yes, my father himself, back in 1984, he insisted that my brother moves out of UK into America, just in case if something happens like Uganda in UK, at least we have somewhere to go. So yes, he had this thing, and maybe it was a trauma or something, but he always felt insecurity of situation, and that, look, let's better have some presence somewhere else, so just in case we have to go. So I think for me, UK has given us a lot of opportunities. I give my personal example with my kids educated here, touch wood, they're all doing very well. I think the Indian community or the Ugandan Asians changed the concept of the corner shops, the late working hours, with Mr. Patel or Mr. Ali or Mr. Virani, personally knowing because of the newspaper delivery, we were looking out for the milkmen. If the bottles were collected or not, we would knock on the door. So we really became very much integrated as a community, as corner shop became part of the communities in the UK. So we served that very well. Today, the second, third generation, obviously, we have started to control the pharmacies in the UK. So that pharmacy business is controlled by Indian or the Ugandan Asian community predominantly now. The corner shops have gone to the Polish community, the Sri Lankan communities have taken those over. So again, thank you so much for letting me be part of this. Mohammed Bhai, you've done amazingly, and so to Ms. Kapoor and Lataji, who I work with on the Ugandan Asian Diaspora 50th anniversary as well, and very much part of it. So thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. And now we'll go on to Daryl Safdeo.
Hi, good afternoon, folks. Once again, a terrific evening of information. I had a quick question. It seems to me, maybe I'm mistaken, that most East African Indians are apolitical or have been apolitical. So I'm just wondering if there was ever a movement to get candidates together and proffer candidates all across East Africa, even just to use money to influence political outcomes.
It's a very interesting question. Is that your question? That let me understand it correctly, that you said Asians did not take part much in politics, but did they ever use money to influence political involvement? Is that the question?
That is the question, yes. And if they ever came together and make a movement to proffer candidate?
You know, to my knowledge, and I'm sure both Vinod and Lata will be able to corroborate, you know, in the Caribbean, you have a very large Indian population. If you take Suriname, you take Guyana, you take Trinidad, you got about 1 million people.
Yeah.
All right. And then you got St. Vincent, you got Grenadine, you got Belize, you got Jamaica. You have a scattering across the area. And the political dynamics there, I think, are different. In East Africa at that time, we were a micro minority. 360,000 people at that time. Today, we are also 360,000. What is the population of the East African Federation today? 300 million. 300 million people in those countries, and the Asians are still 360,000. That's number one. Number two, I don't think, this is my own personal understanding, that the Asians psychologically felt in the 1960s that they would be able to play a role in the political process. The political process in East Africa at the end of empire was very much the Black Africans now getting up and saying, we are ready to rule ourselves. We do not want overseas rule anymore. If you read Kwame Nkrumah at that time, if you read Julius Nyerere at that time, it was very much a Black movement for independence because they had the numbers. And the question at that time was, what is going to be the situation of minorities, micro minorities? Would the new dispensation give the micro minorities some space? It was much more space rather than saying engagement in the political process. So I think there was a different psychological dynamic at play. Now, I'll give you my own example. I mean, I qualified in England as a barrister. It was my dream to become an ambassador someday, whether it would have happened in Canada or in Kenya or wherever. But the situation was very clear that you wouldn't get a position more than a certain level of administrative job. That was the reality at the time. So I don't think the Indians at that time thought in these terms. And I don't think they think in those terms today. If they go back, they're still going to be very much in the economic situation. My argument always is get involved in the political process and make the country democratically fit for rule, whether it's in South Africa, East Africa, or Caribbean or anywhere. Fight for principles and contribute to being part of the scene. But I think that the demographic numbers in East Africa are still very, very small today. Very small.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dado. That's a good question.
Okay, thank you so much. I will take one more question. That will be from Mr. Shamsuddin, and then we will end. But after the program, after the end of the taping, we can still take any persons afterwards. Is that okay, Mohammed?
Perfect with me. And I mean, if you want to take 2 more questions too, I don't mind.
All right, no problem then. Mr. Shamsuddin, you want to go ahead?
Yes, thanks very much for a wonderful presentation. I enjoyed all of it. I would like to know a little bit as a genealogist myself, what is the status of the original documents of Indians landing in East Africa on the whole? I know in Uganda, I don't know if there would be any documents left of the original landings of Indians, because I know there's a move towards connecting the diaspora by this means, by a kind of genealogical means to get the original ship listings and so on. We in Trinidad are doing quite a bit on this, I think, as well as other parts of the diaspora. But I have always been kind of not sure of what is happening in East Africa, since you had that same indentureship kind of origins to East Africa. What really is the status of the documentation? Because we could be linking it with each other eventually in that way.
Very good question, Mr. Shamsuddin.
Thank you.
There is a man called Firoz Navroji. Firoz is an outstanding human rights lawyer, wonderful human being based in Nairobi. And both Firoz and his wife have done a lot of work in this, because you have the African Asian Foundation or Heritage Foundation, I don't know what the right name is. And they have prepared a booklet on the bibliography of the work done on the Asians. I'm not sure what is the status of the original documentation. I know in South Africa, Fatima Mir from Durban and a person called Ashwin Desai have done some fascinating work. I think Kiru Naidu can guide us on this in terms of South Africa.
I know of South Africa, but I was interested in East Africa.
I think what would be wonderful, and I don't mind sharing with you, with Firoz's permission, a link to Firoz. He's a wonderful person. I think we're also going to get him to speak on the Indo-Caribbean chat show. But Firoz has done lots more work on this, and I will be happy to get the connection for you.
Okay, sure. I will appreciate that. Maybe you could pass it on to the program organizers on this afternoon, and I would love to get that. Please do that. Thank you very much, sir. You've been a pleasure to listen to, and now with your help. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, one more. Ranbir, would you like to go ahead with your question? This will be the final question for the afternoon or night.
Good evening, everybody. Apologies for arriving late. I got the wrong time zone. So my question is to Mohammed. Look, great meeting again. Fantastic meeting in London at the Aga Khan Centre. We want to ask, in terms of in South Africa, you got Julius Malema, especially attacking the minority. The Durban riots against Indians, I believe 2 years ago. But in South Africa, Indians were involved in politics. Ahmed Kathrada, Yusuf Daidu, Mark Maharaj. Kathrada was with the Mandela and Robben Island. Ahmed Timmel paid for his life by being thrown from John Forster building for opposing apartheid. At the same time, you had blacks that collaborated. For example, Kaiser Matanzima with John Forster, Lucas Mangopi inviting neo-Nazis to Botswana when it refused to take part in the first multiracial elections. So, you know, it's not the case that Indians are now being portrayed as benefiting from apartheid, but they are, like Ahmed Timur, for example, they suffered, they went in exile, they died. And at the same time, we have black leaders that collaborated. We don't hear about that. Is there a reason for this? Well, keeping quiet on it and change the narrative.
Shakira, would you be able to repeat Ranbir's question, because my ears are a little bit dull.
Sorry, was that too low? I do apologize. Was that not very clear?
Sorry, Ranbir.
Okay. I'll start again. Sorry, Shakira. So, Mohammed, great meeting you again. Sorry I arrived late. Desi time from Punjab, I guess. In South Africa, you have Julius Malema, EFF, portraying Indians as some sort of, you know, parasite, have benefit from apartheid. But you had Indians like Ahmed Kathrada, who had gone to prison with Nelson Mandela. You had Ahmed Timur killed by being shot from John Foster Building, Yusuf Daidu, Mark Maharaj, numerous others. But you also had Africans like Kaiser Matanzima, Mandela's nephew, who collaborated with John Foster. You had Lucas Mangopi from Botswana, who invited neo-Nazis in to stop taking part in the elections. So why not the narrative? Because you have certain Africans who collaborated and Indians who fought apartheid. That's the reality. So
what is your question, Ranbir? Are you saying that why don't we hear about the collaborators?
Yeah, because in South Africa, people were involved in politics, but have been, it seems like they've been edged out. And now the narrative is Indians benefit from apartheid as opposed to Africans who suffered. But there are many Africans who benefit from apartheid, notably the homeland leaders like Mangopi.
Well, you know, South Africa's history, post-apartheid history, is still unfolding. You know, don't forget that during apartheid, not many books could be written. People couldn't speak about what they did. People's documents were destroyed. The special branch police would take you away and pick you up and beat you up and all that. I think what is happening today is that the post-apartheid narrative is beginning to unfold through books, through interviews, through memoirs, through writing. Now, remember one thing, in the South African context, there were people from all racial divides, some who collaborated with the government, with the apartheid government, and some who fought till the end. There were blacks who fought with the government and against the government. Kaiser Matanzima was related to Nelson Mandela, but they were on either side of the political divide. You had some Indians who collaborated with the government and some who didn't, many who didn't. You had people from the Jewish community, many of them like L.B. Sachs, Henry Brown, people like Sidney Cantridge, Joel Joffe. I mean, Ruth First, they gave their lives. There were others who did back the government. So I think like in any freedom struggle, you're going to have people from either side of the divide. But I think, Ranbir, I was just thinking this afternoon, as I was driving, I said the entire narrative in South Africa is about Nelson Mandela. But Mr. Mandela said, you don't gain independence through one person. He said, I was the leader of a movement. I was fortunate that I had the most wonderful people. And I think that there is a need in my submission for giving a much broader understanding of the narrative. And I think that will happen. Not that Mr. Mandela didn't do what he did. I'm a great admirer of him. But it wasn't him. It was him leading thousands of people whose voices we haven't even heard today. So I think we need to develop the narrative, if I may put it that way.
Fantastic. I agree wholeheartedly. Thank you so much, Mohammed.
Sure.
Fantastic. Mohammed, Lata, thank you so very much for joining us. It was an amazing program. Thank you.
Thank you, Shakira. Thank you, Lata. I want to thank Lata for all that she's done for the British Ugandan Asian commemorative year. I want to pay particular tribute to Fayaz Moghul for the program that he sponsored, and to Mihir Patel of the India Overseas Trust and the people who worked with them. It was a team effort. But I think Uganda has given us an opportunity to connect with all you wonderful people working in the Caribbean. We want to learn from you. You have a bigger demographic base than ours. We want to learn from Fiji. We want to get to know more from Mauritius. So I want to pay my tribute to all those who are contributing to this knowledge endeavor. I want to thank you, Shakira, and to Shalima, and to Kumar. I believe you came on for a while, just to thank them for making this possible. And I'm available if you want to have a chat after the recording is over. We can chat for a few minutes. There's no problem. For anyone who wants to stay around, yes.
All right, so we will end the program, and we want to thank all our speakers for sharing their expertise and for giving of their time. And we want to thank all the members of our audience on Zoom and YouTube for attending and participating. So Shobi will formally close the program now. Shobi?
Thank you, Shakira. And thank you for being a great moderator today and stepping in place of Shalima. Thank you to everyone that's joined us today for taking the time to attend and participate. As was said earlier, this is a public meeting and it's being hosted by the Indo-Caribbean Cultural Centre. Please feel free to contact the ICC to publish your books and reports. Remember that we are asking you kindly for your suggestions as well as a donation. Please contact Dr. Mahabir for details on this. Thanks to the advisory team and the planning team, which is led by Dr. Kumar Mahabir. Also thanks to our IT manager, Ravin Rang Singh, who has been recording the program behind the scenes and will upload it to our website and to our YouTube channel permanently for posterity. Our topic next week, Sunday, will be the live ICC non-profit cultural tour of Suriname. Please visit our YouTube channel to see our past recordings. I am Shobi Ali, signing off and saying bye-bye, God bless you, Dhanyavad.
Thank you, Shobi.
Good, Shakira. We've got some people who are around who may still want to chat, and I'm sure that we have a few minutes. I just